Right. So I had the honor to recently return from Cuba, and I have to say the most amazing thing about going to Cuba is to see that they're fighting every day, but they won. You know, we struggle here under such challenging conditions and under such overwhelming against such overwhelming odds, and it's amazing to see that the victory is possible. That they defeated U.S. imperialism in 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and it's a real thing to stand in front of the memorial to Jose Marti with the famous statue of Che and Cienfuegos. You know, that's a real place, and you know it's. Anyway. So I thought it might be helpful before go any further to just review some of the political events that have happened recently in Cuba and around Cuba that a lot of people in the U.S. have questions about like what is going on in Cuba, what is the situation, and I think those would be three general categories. There were a series of economic liberalization laws in 2011 that changed a number of ways the economy works. There was the thaw in U.S. relations beginning in 2014, and of course there was the death of Fidel last year. Those economic changes involved an increase in foreign investment, including allowing non-Cuban majority-owned enterprises, in a few cases even 100% foreign-owned. A continuing increase in investment in tourism to bring more hard capital, more hard cash into the country, allowing the free sale of homes and businesses, homes and cars, and also allowing the expansion of small private businesses, hotels in people's homes, little barbershops, things like that. So a lot of people see this as the end of Cuban socialism, that capital is flowing into the country and that the game's basically over. And I was happy to see that that's very much not the case. I had the honor of attending the March of the Torches, which is held every January 27th, the day before the birthday of Jose Marti, the Cuban national hero. And this is a march that was started in 1953 at the University of Havana. It's been there every year since, and it was it must have been over 20,000 students marching through the streets of Havana, chanting "Yo soy Fidel," and it was a really beautiful sight to see, and it was also a great opportunity to talk to young people and get their thoughts on the situation there. And so, if you read the article in the paper that the managing editors were so kind to ask me to write. There are a few of those quotes. I just think one that's worth mentioning. This is from an engineering student. A lot of people that think that when Fidel died, the revolution was going to fall apart, but that's not going to happen. The young Cubans are carrying the revolution forward. A big change is the change in U.S.-Cuban relations, which should benefit both countries. But that doesn't mean we will give up any of the principles we have struggled for, or that we will let ourselves be defeated. Another student made it very clear what those principles were, the principles of anti-imperialism, patriotism, and I think we always have to be conscious when we talk about patriotism, nationalism, that there's a difference between the patriotism of the oppressed and the oppressor. And so in a place like Cuba, when they talk about patriotism, it's the exact opposite of what it means here. And also Latin Americanism, and then specifically healthcare and education. Those are not going anywhere. Another development there that I think is important is there has been a growth in the petty bourgeoisie in Cuba in the past 5 years as a result of the number of small businesses. And those are mostly funded by foreign capital coming from Miami, or people who, by working in the tourism industry, have access to additional money, because most Cuban workers do not have the money to start a small business. It's not practical, as is the case everywhere. Workers don't have access to capital, and I think there is a response there from the state to ensure that workers aren't exploited, because now you do have people entering into a relationship on a small scale where they're working with someone who's earning a profit off their labor, and so that's very much been so that is something that is in discussion in Cuba. these days, is the cultural impact of that. A lot of money is coming in from tourism, and that's being used for a variety of things. A lot of it is being reinvested into the tourism industry, and you see huge hotels going up there because it's a way to, it brings a lot of cash into the country, and it takes a lot of capital to compete with Cancun and places like that. So a lot of it is being reinvested, and the money that is not being reinvested, a lot of it is going to provide industrialization and infrastructure to other industries. For example, for farming. A long-standing issue in Cuba is that they don't have the industrial equipment necessary to extract the maximum harvests from the incredibly fertile land they've had there. And so that money is being reinvested in those industries to facilitate that. I mean, it's a challenge of the Cuban Revolution, and a lot of revolutions we see in the 20th century, that they're trying to build socialism before achieving complete industrialization. And this is the nature of imperialism, and it's a challenge they're always trying to struggle with. Furthermore, I would say that I think it's important to talk about Fidel's death and the impact that's had in Cuba. Certainly there were a lot of naysayers here who would point out who would say, oh, he's dead, it's all over, it's all going to come crashing down, this is all built around Fidel, it has no power outside of him. And nothing could be farther from the truth. As many of you may have heard, one of Fidel's last wishes was there will be no monument built to Fidel, and then nothing will be named after him, because, as another student put it, Fidel wanted to make it clear that he wasn't the revolution, that the people were the revolution. Don't think the revolution is over because Fidel has died. We were strong, and we will continue with his ideas. If I could make just one final point before I yield the mic, it would be that on arriving in Cuba, I'd have to say my first impression, and I've noticed a lot of other people I've discussed this with had similar experiences, is that people in Cuba have dignity. They have dignity, and you see it in the children, in the way they play in the streets, in the way they interact with their parents, and it's shocking because it's something that you just don't see in this country very much, even among people whose objective conditions are much better than the vast majority of people in Cuba. That because their country, their land, their factories don't belong to anyone else. They belong to the Cuban people, and that gives them an essential dignity that I think is worth striving for. So, thank you all so much. And to my understanding, all of the hotels in Cuba that are being built, the resort type stuff, is either 100% Cuban owned or majority Cuban owned. And I mean, until a few years ago, that was the case with every enterprise in Cuba. I know there are a few exceptions now, but I believe in the hotel industry, it's all still majority Cuban owned. Because in the cases where it's not, it generally has to do with trying to bring some very specific industry that they can't otherwise get into the country, and that's not the case with hotels. So, a few other things. I forgot to mention during the talk that it was so incredible to turn on the Cuban nightly news every night. And you know what the top story was? JFK. The airports in Baltimore. The airports in LA. That was all over the news there. And I mean, it was a big deal. It was interesting because the Trump protests on J20 did not get a lot of coverage. I think because the Cuban government was, to a certain degree, wanted to feel out the situation in the U.S. and see what was going on. But once there were all those people in the streets, and that was a huge story. So that was incredible to see. A few other things. The race question in Cuba, I just want to make a brief comment about that, because I did have a few people there tell me some anecdotes about, racial oppression that they had experienced there. And I mean, that is still a struggle that's ongoing. The revolution doesn't end the struggles against oppression. What it does is it changes the balance of forces through which those struggles are carried out. Because racism in this country exists for reasons that benefit the capitalist class. It divides the working class, and it allows certain sections of the working class to be super exploited. In Cuba, racism is doesn't serve the interests of the ruling class, being the workers. It's a holdover from capitalism that people are fighting to purge from their society, and they've not succeeded in doing that yet. But that's okay. But that's a fight that is every day in Cuba, and is certainly further along than I would say than what you see in this country. To Renee's point, it's absolutely the case that people in Cuba are in constant conversation about the nature of their society. And through the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution and just, people hanging out, that has objective effects on what happens in Cuba. And I don't have time to go through the whole process by which representatives to the municipal, state, and national assemblies are chosen, but it is one that has at its center the idea that certain groups, women from the trade unions, and so on, must be represented. And the whole system is built around that. Let's see, what else? A quick comment about, as Teresa raised, sometimes you find leftists in the U.S. with a sort of disdain for Cuba. Cuba doesn't exist for us. Cuba may inspire us, but it doesn't exist to fit our ideas of how a struggle should be waged. It exists for the Cuban people. And it's crazy that's even a question, but it is. You see it all the time. People want to sit in their comfortable offices at some university and talk about how the DPRK or Cuba doesn't know. What have you done? What have you done? You start a revolution, then you talk some shit, okay? All right. Okay. Just one last thing. This is to Richard's point. One other chant I heard down there, and I only remember in translation, is "Raul, don't worry, we are with you." But the "Yo soy Fidel," when I have ever heard people say that in the United States, how I always understood it was it an expression that Fidel is an example, an inspiration, and that when someone says that, they're saying, I'm like him, or I'm trying to live up to that. When I was in the streets with people chanting that, I understood, though, that it had another, and I think more significant meaning, which was that Fidel is the representative, is a symbol of a revolution that the people are. And so when they're saying "Yo soy Fidel," they're taking ownership of the revolution. And so I thought, and that was unmistakable in the streets. And so anyway, I hope that's all helpful. So.